Hello, I am the Panda King, and I am here doing an interview with my teacher, Mr. Ritter, the author of the Jackaby series. So, Mr. Ritter, tell us a bit about yourself.
Hi, I am a teacher and an author. I started writing when I was just a kid, and I loved writing just throughout school. I loved writing short stories and poetry and all kinds of things, and really got serious about it after I had already become a teacher. Actually, I'd taken some time to work in the classroom, and I enjoyed teaching mythology and creative writing, which I get to teach now again, and began writing Jackaby as sort of a natural conduit for those thoughts that as I was writing, I was able to play with those ideas about mythology and work ideas from the cultures that I've been teaching my students into the stuff that I was writing for my readers.
Nice. Alright, so, what led you to start writing the Jackaby series?
I was between jobs at the time, so I just worked a position where I was teaching mythology, and had been talking to a science teacher about doing a combined class that had mythology elements to it, but then was really getting into more of a CSI approach. Right? Rather than teaching the myths and fantasy stuff, I would be leaning more toward teaching crime fiction. And so he was interested in teaching the CSI, sort of actual science behind it, and having me teach detective fiction, things like the C. Auguste Dupin and Sherlock Holmes and those sorts of things. And I loved that idea, and although the class wound up not being able to happen, the combo class couldn't come about, those ideas were still in my head, and so a lot of those ideas bouncing around the mythology that I had been teaching with these sort of crime fiction tropes that I was prepping for became sort of the Jackaby series.
Nice, so you combined them to pretty much make Sherlock Holmes meets Centaurs.
Yes, yeah, exactly. That sort of, Sherlock Holmes and Supernatural and Buffy the Vampire Slayer had lots of comparisons that I really like. I'm a big nerd myself, so I love seeing it compared to the kinds of things that I like to watch.
Yeah. Right. I feel the first book left off at a spot where you could have left the series. Was this intentional? And if so, what made you decide to continue the series?
Yeah, it was intentional. From the very beginning, I had ideas for where I wanted to go with the story, but I also knew that there was a chance that it would either never get published, or if it did, I might only ever get the one chance. So I tried to make the first story feel complete, so that if that was all that hit shelves, it would feel like a complete, cohesive story. And having gotten that done, having gotten an agent, having made my way into publishing, I was able to actually sell it and a second book as a single deal, so I knew that I was going to have that opportunity. So there are little hints of the threads that will continue throughout the rest of the series in that first book, and there are the seeds for what will become the story all the way through the last book. But they're intentionally planted in a way that you don't need the threads to be tied off in order to have a satisfying end.
Gotcha. When do you find time to work on these books, considering you're also a teacher and a father?
I don't. I carve out time. That my wife is very supportive. She makes it possible for me to write, particularly during spring breaks and summer breaks, especially summer. I get the bulk of my work done. But a lot of that is that I'm putting kids into summer camps, or she's looking after my kids during some of those chunks of time. And then it's a dedication to doing something that I really want to do. That if you find that there's something that you are absolutely focused on, you're able to find time to do that in ways that if it were somebody else's project, if I were being asked to help somebody else out doing some little extra credit thing, I probably wouldn't have the time for it, and I wouldn't find the time for it. But because it's something that I care about, I'll stay up until 1 in the morning finishing an idea before I let it go.
Nice. So whenever you're not being a teacher,
Yeah, pretty much. You're always writing.
And when someone else is able to take over the role of parenting.
Yes, yeah, and having support is incredibly helpful. Having somebody both to physically give you the time, so you actually have that to use, but then also just giving you the support to say what you're doing is worthy, what you're doing is worth taking the time to do, and that's, I think, true for any artist, whether you're painting or writing or creating music. It's useful to have somebody there who says that what you're doing isn't frivolous, that it's worth taking the time to do, and she does that for me as well.
So how do you come up with the ideas for your stories? What's the thought process?
A lot of my stories are an excuse to tell stories within the story. So I have a lot of opportunities to tell myths, especially folklore from around the world. And then beyond that, a lot of the character development comes from characters in my own life, and myself, and my wife, and my father, and my mother, and figures that throughout history I've found intriguing. So occasionally there are figures out of history that I'll take and I'll twist and I'll make into somebody else, so they're their own character, and it frees me up to be able to play with them however I want to. But I like being able to put the elements of people that I found particularly irritating or particularly amazing and put them into a character in ways that make them feel more real. But really everything, when you're writing, everything is material. Every person that you meet, everything that you do kind of becomes material for what might or might not ever wind up in a book someday.
Nice. Do you often do a lot of research on mythological creatures, stories, and other things for your books?
I do. Again, I'm a big nerd, so I build the books as an excuse to do the things that I love to do. So when I'm working on a scene that I know that I want some kind of a creature in here, it gives me the excuse to then pop open my books and start pawing through them and finding something that I like, or to go online and start looking for creatures from particular regions that I'm looking for, particular kinds of creatures that I'm looking for. So that's a lot of fun. So I do a lot of that, probably more research than I need to for that side of it, because it's just fun to do. But then also, as I teach mythology, so I'm occasionally inspired by the things that either I've taught my students recently, or even that my students have found on their own, and I find interesting that I get this chance to go back and revisit underworld myths, or I go back and revisit some the Greek Herculean legends and things like that. And so I get a chance to put some of those into the stories if I found them particularly inspirational, or if I found them particularly interesting and weird and fun. So yeah, I do a little bit of research for an individual project on purpose, but then I'll also do a lot of it just for fun.
Nice. So kind of like with the red cap in the first book, was that something you knew before, or only when you were like, I need someone for this?
I did know about red caps. There are lots of creatures, red caps included, that I don't see a lot of in YA lit. That you get vampires and werewolves occasionally, but you don't see a lot of other mythological figures. So that was part of the design of it. Not that I'm against werewolves or vampires, I like those too, they can find their way in. But I like the idea of having creatures who are not part of sort of the standard fare, because there's so many of them out there. It's worth being able to explore.
Do any of the characters represent any specific person in real life, be it someone from your personal life or from history?
Yes, to varying degrees. As I mentioned, all the people that I've met are kind of fair game for stealing personality traits. But I occasionally tuck elements in. There's only one character who's based directly on a real person who I've known. And she is, her inspiration is a woman who passed away when I was at the University of Oregon. She went by the name Hatun. And so Hatun, the character in the book, is spelled slightly differently. I intentionally shifted the spelling to make sure that it was a different person. But she's the most directly based on a real person. That she was a transient woman who saw the world in interesting ways and was every bit the hero that the world that she lived in needed. And so that character shows up again, and she's meant as a tribute, really, to that woman. I think she was a great and very troubled woman. But then other characters, there's in book 2, for instance, there's a woman who's very directly based on a couple of different figures from history. And in book 3, I've introduced another character who's based largely on students that I've known, and so there are different figures who show up, and I like to intentionally make them fictionalized, even if I'm basing them very closely on one person or another. I like to intentionally fictionalize them, both to avoid offending anyone, and to free me up to be able to make them good or bad, or twist them around in different ways to fit the story.
How does your family feel about you being an author, and how do you feel about it?
I've been very lucky. My family's very proud of me. I've got 2 boys who are just a little young for my demographic. Oh, we've lost our visual. We have to tap our computer there. Sorry though. My sons are very proud of me, and so I'll get to go out to the bookstore when I'm looking for books with the kids every once in a while. And your book is on the shelf here, and that feels very proud to be able to have them showing me off in that way. And then, of course, I've got friends and relatives who've come out to events that I've done and been very supportive. So I feel very lucky to have a large group of friends and family there to support me.
That's good. Jonathan, could you click the button? No? Do you plan on ending the Jackaby series anytime soon?
I do, actually. The last book will be out in August of this year. And it'll be a 4-part series altogether. And it's, since I was finishing the first book, I had kind of a sense of where the arc was going. So I knew I was going to be at about 4 books. And I found once I actually got to the 4th book, it was the largest draft that I had created. It was running 15 to 20,000 words over what it should have been, and cropped that down considerably. It's still probably going to be the largest of the books, but I cropped it down by a large degree. Entire chapters got taken out, which is hard to do. But at that point, I knew that there were these things that I wanted to do before the story was done, and I hadn't done them yet, and so I was kind of cramming more things in than that specific story really needed. And so it's really for the best to cut those out and let it be the story it needs to be.
You kind of realized that I kind of put way too much not necessary stuff.
Yes, absolutely.
Compress necessary stuff.
This is only here because I wanted to do this, and it's not part of the story, so I can get rid of that. So my editors have been fantastic about that. Algonquin Young Readers is the publisher that I work with, and Elise Howard is my editor. And she's got a phenomenal eye for knowing what a story really is trying to be and what's holding it back from being that. So she'll often draw out the things that I was trying for without even knowing that I was trying for them. So she's been phenomenal about that.
Do you plan to, or do you want to write another book series? Maybe focusing on creatures from other cultures?
Yeah, I've got one underway already that's sort of part of the Jackaby universe, though not following any of the characters from any of the other books, not a spin-off on anyone or anything like that, but just set in the same sort of world. And that one would be probably a little bit younger, and there's elements of it that would be similar, but also, yes, borrowing folklore from around the world still for that series. Dealing with kind of different themes. As you mentioned, I'm a father, and so there's some elements in there about family and about how sort of different families come together. That was important to me. So I'm hopeful that one gets picked up, and if not, there's other things beyond that.
So your plan for the next series is pretty much with what happened with the Percy Jackson series. They finish it, and then they go on following a new set of characters.
Sort of.
Kind of basic thing.
Percy Jackson, the Rick Riordan does an amazing job of. He focuses in first on the Greeks, and then he kind of did a variant on that with the Romans, and then he did a totally different story with the Red Pyramid, focusing on the Egyptians, and now with the Norse. And he's tied in a few characters between them, kind of making them the same universe. I'm leaning more toward. I do mixed mythology throughout all of my books, so each of mine have characters from all over the world showing up in each of them. So a little less distinct than his. You could really just focus in on a single series of his, and it stands cohesively as so the Greek series, the Egyptian series. And for at least for the moment, I'm looking a little more at Terry Pratchett style. Actually, if you've ever read any of the Discworld series, that he has a cohesive world. But within that world, there are series where you might focus on sort of the police department, and you're following the Watch, and Sam Vimes leading the Watch, and all the people around him. And then you might read a completely different story. Now you're talking about Moist Van Lipweep, and he's a criminal, and he's running around. And then you're reading a completely different story. It's talking about the wizards or the witches or different things. And so each of those characters might run into each other because they exist in the same world, or they might mention the same cities, things like that. But they exist on their own, and they don't need each other to exist. And that's kind of the way I see myself putting together this world. I love Terry Pratchett. I love the way that he set that up. And so I like the idea of being able to just come back into the toy box and play. And so having built the toy box, I'm reticent to leave it alone.
Will we ever see the return of Jackaby's hat that met with a heated debate in the second book?
It continues to be mentioned through to the end. So book 4 does have some ugly hat references as well. But that was one piece that my editor from the very beginning shuddered at. We can really get rid of the hat, and he'd be a much cooler character. And I said he's not supposed to be cool, and so we kept it in. But But yes, no, that he continues to have terrible fashion sense through to the bitter end. Yes.
Perfect. And which one of your 4 books, including the one coming out soon, was your favorite, either to write or to read?
That's hard to say. I have strong feelings about all of them for different reasons. I loved the first one because there were a lot of firsts for me. That it was my first published novel, and there were lots of things that I got to do with that book for the very first time. On the other hand, though, I think it's also just from a pure sort of talent perspective, I think it's my worst book. That I think there are lots of things that I graduated from the school of writing a dang book to figure out how to do things better by the time I had written the second, and third, and fourth books. So the second book has elements in it that I really love, and there have been I've had some folks tell me that was their favorite. And there are things about it that I think worked just right, and qualities that came out exactly the way I had hoped for them to. For a while, I was feeling that way though about book 3. That there were things in there that I had tucked in that I was worried about, nervous about the way that they were going to come across. Oh my God, our bells. So there were things in book 3 that I'm very happy with the way that they came out, but I don't know that I would call it my favorite. Because now that I've written the 4th book. The 4th book was, as I mentioned, the most oversized and the most rushed of all of them. But it's also, it finally ties off those threads in more satisfying ways. It's probably, hopefully, the most satisfying of the series. Yeah, impossible to pin it down to just the one.
Alright. Is there any particular... Hold on. Is there any particular reason all of the books covers have an image in someone's head?
Yeah, the artwork there is Joel Tippy's work. J Drift Designs does the covers. He does an amazing job, marvelous job with the covers. In the first book, we're really focusing on Jackaby. He's the new exciting thing. He's the strange thing. The narrator remains Abigail Rook throughout the series, but Jackaby is the big picture. So he winds up being the big picture on the cover there.
Oh, sorry for the interruption. Jonathan neglected to let us know that we were running out of memory. So he has since been fired. And it's the next day and we're going to continue on. So, as you were saying about the particular reason for the book covers having the image of someone's head?
Yeah, each of the books has a central figure to it. So in the first book, you wind up with Jackaby is the most important character because he's new and it's interesting, and the narrator is following his life and getting to know about him. And in the second book, the narrator herself, Abigail, becomes a little more central. We get to see her rising to her own strengths a little bit more. The third book, we see a little more of Jenny's story. It's really about solving her mystery. And the last will feature Charlie, who comes into play a little bit more heavily. So all of them are ensemble cast stories, and all of them are involved in each story. But because of the focus of each one, the heads wound up being more significant for each. And Joel Tippy did the designs on all of those. I got to have a little bit of input at the start of the kinds of things I'd like to see in them, but the design is entirely his work, and he did a great job.
Very good. Is there any one culture that you like to pull creatures from more than others?
I like the Norse. I like Viking mythology. They're fun in their body, and their stories are really made to be enjoyed, and I enjoyed that about them. And a lot of the creatures that come out of Norse mythology have become staples in fantasy. Tolkien was a big fan of the Norse, and so you see elements taken just directly from Norse mythology in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and things like that. Otherwise, I like playing with some of the Celtic myths. I'm Scotch and Irish also, and so I got elements of that in my stories as well. But I like mostly just borrowing things from all over the world to make sure that none of them are focused too much on just one culture, but that you get a little bit of everything.
Interesting. Is there anything in the books, be it an item, creature, or belief, that you just made up and is not from any culture?
There are. In each of the books, there's elements that are completely me. I do try to plant them in ways that feel real. So there are creatures from all over the world as well as things that I just created. So we'll get, for instance, in the second book, there's a creature that I won't spoil, but a creature who is not from any particular mythology, but borrows from elements of history and borrows from elements of a real zoology and cryptozoology, and just fits for what I was working with. There are also creatures that are based on sort of archetypes of creatures. I mentioned therianthropy in the first book, which is the ability for a human-like figure to also transform into an animal figure. And so we see that in lycanthropy, we see that in werewolves often. But therianthropy leaves open the door for lots of different sort of creature transformation figures. So I play with things that are common in folklore, but not necessarily tied to any one creature or another.
Gotcha. Are there any things that are intended to be a mix of culture, like a creature or a place where two or more cultures have similar variants of the same thing, but you decide to combine them into one?
Yeah, that's a good question too. I can think of a specific example. In the very first book, there's a creature mentioned, there are kobolds mentioned, and there are varying versions of those that are from Germanic legend. And also the Domovoi and Domovik, which are Slavic, and those are both mentioned just within the first chapter or two. And those are creatures that exist and have variants, as I was mentioned, but they've kind of been combined or honed down to just the one. And then other elements. Book 3, for instance, I do an underworld journey in that one, and the main character leading them down into the underworld is Greek, but then along the way they're seeing Egyptian and Norse elements, and so the underworld itself is, in that version, really a combination of all of the underworlds from lots of different fables.
Nice. Is there any one of your books where, if given the chance, you'd go back and change it? Be it because you felt it was lackluster, there was something you wanted to add or remove, or you just felt that there were parts that weren't explained well?
Constantly. I can't read over any of my writing without wanting to fix it. So I'll read even just little nuanced things that aren't technically wrong or errors. I'll read over a passage and if I switched these two words, it'd be so much stronger. If I added a different adjective there, it'd be so much stronger. And there are things in the first book there. Knowing where a character wound up in the last books, I might have introduced them slightly differently, or knowing now, looking back on other books that have come out that have similar themes and the ways in which they're the same, there are things that I might have done just to intentionally make things different. But in the end, you have to let go of that. You have to let a book be what it is, and I'm very proud of the way that all of them have come out anyway. That even if they're not ever going to be changed and ever going to be different, I can be okay with that.
Very good. And lastly, is there anything that you would like to talk about that we have not yet?
Oh, just that I'm not anyone special. That I can create stories because I love folklore. I can create stories because I love mythology and creative writing. I love storytelling. But I'm just a nerd who likes storytelling. And I wrote the kind of book that I wanted to exist in the world. I wrote the kind of book that I wanted to read. And anyone can do that. Anyone can create a story, can create a movie, can create a piece of art that brings into the world what they wish was there, and get over the idea that there's some magic special person behind the scenes who does that writers are this special magical group of people who somehow have talent that you don't have, because I don't have any talent that's beyond anything that you have, or that any of my students have, or anyone that I've ever met has. So yeah, I guess the last piece would be, that be confident that you can do this just as easily as I can, if not much better.
Anything else?
I think that's it.
All right. Well, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time on The Panda King.
Bye.
Bye.